Yes.
Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, and a very warm welcome here to the Advocates Library, and welcome to this joint lecture between the University of Edinburgh English Literature Department and the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club. And thank you very much for being here this evening. It's always a pleasure to be here in the Advocates Library. I think particularly on a cold evening like this, it's rather a cosy room to be in, and maybe particularly apt to be here to listen to this lecture about dark, restless borderers. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, and I'm very delighted to welcome Dr. Valentina Bold to deliver our lecture this evening. So a little bit about Dr. Bold. Valentina lives in Stirling and works half of the week as Heritage Policy Officer with the Crichton Trust in Dumfries. The rest of the time she's freelance, writing, researching and presenting evidence. Prior to that, she was an academic for 30 years, working most recently at the University of Stirling. She's an Honorary Fellow at the University of Edinburgh, where she edits the Review of Scottish Culture and also edits a successful series on the history and culture of Scotland for Peter Lang. Valentina has a significant back catalogue of publications on a wide variety of topics and Scottish literary and cultural topics, with a particular interest in poetry and song. However, she's best known for her work on James Hogg, including her influential book, James Hogg, A Bard of Nature's Making. As part of the celebration for James Hogg's 250th anniversary, running 2020 to 2021, she organised and performed in the premiere of Hogg's play, The Royal Jubilee, at the Scottish Poetry Library. And Valentina has talked about Hogg internationally too, in Europe, Canada and the USA. And of course, we're delighted that you're here with us in the Advocates Library in Edinburgh this evening, and very excited to hear your talk. So welcome, Valentina.
Thanks very much, and it's lovely to be here too, although with a picture of Scott behind me, I'm quite conscious of a duty to represent him fairly. So it is a real pleasure to be here, the apocryphal pleasure, but I'm going to get a chance to speak about two of my favourite poets tonight. One of them I prefer more to the other, but I'll leave that for you to decide as we go along. And what I thought might be interesting was to focus really on what Hogg thought about Scott and how he perceived their shared affinity as two dark, restless borderers. So the talk is in two parts. The first one is going to look at the early relationship between Scott and Hogg and their first meeting. The second part, which will be a little shorter, I hope, will explore how that relationship changed over time. And what I want to suggest is that while Hogg was a loyal friend, a borderer who felt a bond with Scott for life, Scott was perhaps a little bit more restless in his affections. So the quotation in my title is from a poem in James Hogg's The Poetic Mirror, which was published in 1816, at the height of his fame, post the successful Queen's Wake of 1813. And in the Mirror, Hogg said about that work that he had intended it to be representative of the finest contemporary poets in Scotland and England, and invited many of these people to contribute, but hardly any did. Byron apparently offered a piece, but Scott didn't. So Hogg decided to do the next best thing, which was to write the whole book himself in the style of all his favourite poets. Byron, Southey, Wordsworth were all represented, and Scott appears twice. But I think probably the better of the Scott imitation, and one in the best book, and I should say that they're all quite tongue-in-cheek, is the one that mentions dark, restless borderers, and that's Water the Clwch. And it's a very fast-paced piece. It's a borders romp, I would say, in that kind of pseudo-balladic style that Scott and Hogg loved so much. So I'll quote a little bit from that, with a little ghostly echo on the screen. It would appear. Water the Cleuch come down through the dale in helmet and hauberk a glistening mail. Full proudly he came on his berry black steed, caparisons belted for warrior deed. Oh, bold was the bearing and brisk the career, and broad was the cuirass and long was the spear, and tall was the plume that waved over the broom o' that dark reckless borderer, Water the Cleuch. His housing, the buck's hide of rude massy fold, was tasselled and tufted with trappings of gold. The henchman was stalwart, his buckler that bore. He had bowmen behind him and billmen before. He had Belladin, Thorleshope, Reddlesford Green, and Habba the Swire, and Jockapole and Whiston and Halston, and Hardride and Hugh were all at the back of bold Water the Cleuch. And I think in these words, Hogg really has Scott. You might disagree, and I know there are Scott experts in this room, but I think he has Scott down to a T. There's a flavour of the minstrelsy of the Scottish border. There's that kind of antiquarian idiom that you find in the Lay of the Last Minstrel. And Scott's really there in the standard words and the formulaic phrases that kind of sound like ballad, but aren't, like the bold bearings that are mentioned in that extract, the gold trappings and the berry black steed, and that thundering what's known as long measuring ballad, the 4-4-4-4. Water the Cleuch came down through the dale in helmet and hauberk a glistening mail. And Hogg runs with that style throughout the piece in quite meticulous detail to capture Scott, sprinkling it with a touch of knowing humour, just as Scott liked. And that anti-hero, Wat, I think has an effect just written straight out of a riding ballad. He's first cousin to Marmion, he's kin to Red Gauntlet, and he's related to the antiquarian Scott himself at quite an early stage of his career, it has to be said. But there's also purpose in that imitation. By showing that he has the ability to replicate the style of Scott and his other subjects, Hogg is presenting himself as his literary equal, far more than just the Ettrick shepherd. This was someone who knew Scott's work and his life very well, and this was the impression that he was seeking to give. Now, the image in that slide is of Yarrow. It's Hogg's own home as a mature writer at Eldenhope in the middle. And for those who are here more in the Scott camp than Hogg, and perhaps only know his name through the amazing private memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, I thought it might be helpful just to give a really quick recap about his life, but at a conservative estimate, I would say half of the room actually know more about Hogg's life than I do, so please forgive me because I'm going to tell you stuff you already know, but if you don't know it, I think you might find it helpful. So, I like a Venn diagram, and I think there are really three main aspects to Hogg's biography, starting off with his working life in the borders. There's his literary life in poetry and prose that focused in Edinburgh, although it was also conducted in the borders, and that intersects with his borders life. And in some ways, thinking about this, where Scott was an Edinburgh man who needed the borders because of his family ties as the sheriff, Hogg was a borderer who needed Edinburgh as a writer for his audience and for socialising with the literati. But the way in which Hogg documented agricultural life, that third element, its culture and traditions, for both of these places, allowed him to confidently posture in the term Burns used, and I really like, used it for a book title, as a writer who was a bard of nature's making. A very special individual who, for good and ill, in the line of Burns as a peasant poet, operated on a separate plane to other writers, although obviously they didn't. It's a long topic, I won't go into it just now. But this is where the worlds interact. For Hogg, standing alongside Scott as a restless borderer was a conscious act, just as identifying himself as a bard of nature's making, like Burns, was a conscious act. Or to be more specific, he identified himself clearly in his sobriquet as an Ettrick writer with a corner of Selkirkshire as his turf. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's just posturing. There was a really great sense of duty, I think, towards the borders and everything that Hogg wrote. His were the stories of family, of community, of a particular place, sometimes reflected in national narratives, but very much focused on that location. possibly with the exception of the confessions, although he brings it back to the border areas at the end. But Scott is slightly different. His were stories of Scotland, I think, sometimes located in the borders, and in the case of the minstrelsy, very consciously located in the borders, even though he was borrowing from other parts of Scotland, like Dumfries and Galloway and the North East. But Hogg was hugely committed, I'd suggest much more so than Scott, to portraying his traditions responsibly, albeit creatively, and to sharing them, much as a traditional storyteller passes on the stories of those who went before them, enhancing them through their own skills. For Scott, I often think that the process was more like collecting, about stamping his creative authority and ownership on traditions for consumption by city people and the country aristocracy, his peers or his near peers. So it's a difference of approach in the way that they engaged with the borders. Now, I've got another slide which is almost unreadable, but it'll give you an idea of, if you don't know already, about Hogg's prolific productions. Poetry, prose, lyric collections, the seminal Jacobite Relics, the first collection of that kind of song, and humorous work, profoundly traditional work, like the Three Pearls of Man and Three Pearls of Women. And I've put some in bold that I think are particularly relevant, like the Brownie of Bodsbeck, which Hogg later asserted with a fair degree of annoyance predated Scott's prior publication of Old Mortality, and made Hogg have to make some creative revisions. There is some evidence that Hogg had the idea as early as 1814, so he may be right in that. And Douglas Mack told me that, so that's on good authority. But the two writers no doubt exchanged ideas, and one went to press earlier than the other, which caused Hogg a little bit of embarrassment. But unlike Scott, Hogg worked from a very early age, and we're talking about hard physical graft. And again, for those who don't know so much about them, about the family, he left school at the age of about 7 to take up his first job as a cowherd, and I've listed some of the more important members of his family on that slide. His paternal family, the Hoggs, who included some really fine singers, and his maternal family, his grandfather Will of Fope, and that's the Bothy at Fope on that slide, his uncle, and the Laidlaw family more generally, his mother Margaret Laidlaw. And the other thing I think that's always really interesting about Hogg is that a lot of his work really takes place in a very small area of the borders, and I would estimate it at around 5 mile radius largely, the area around where he was born. But yeah, and that sort of sums that up too. But Hogg and Scott, as I'm sure most of you know, or many of you know, first met through their shared and continuing love of borders culture and through Scott's minstrelsy project. At the time of their first meeting, both men were around 30. Scott had achieved a little bit of notoriety from his translations from the German. Hogg had published his first book, Scottish Pastorals. Scott had recently become Sheriff of Selkirkshire in 1799, and he was also a father for the first time. Hogg was shepherding at Blackhouse and unmarried as yet, was shepherding in the borders. So Scott's living in Edinburgh. It's prior to 1804 when he comes to live at Ash's Tail, but he's raiding the borders for ballads with various amanuenses, including the poet John Leyden and William Laidlaw, who's a distant relative or a relative of Hogg's. Laidlaw was later the factor at Abbotsford, and he was the son of Hogg's employers at Blackhouse and therefore related to Hogg's mother. And he joined the minstrelsy project quite recently through Scott's correspondent Mercer and alerted Scott to Hogg's family as tradition bearers. And at Blackhouse, Laidlaw had already encouraged this aspiring young writer Hogg, who'd recently published in the Scots magazine too, to transcribe his family ballads for Hogg, the transcripts that are now over in the NLS. And some of Hogg's family songs had impressed Scott and were included in volume 3 of the minstrelsy, including the Battle of Otterburn, Dowie Hounds of Yarrow, and the Gay Goshawk, and also the disputed text of Old Maitland, which many people felt had a hand of Hogg's in it. So the place where the two poets would first meet in person, or the way in which Hogg foregrounded their meetings, is very significant to the way that he presented their friendship. According to Hogg, and he was writing over 30 years after the event when he described this, after Scott's death too, in the Anecdotes of Walter Scott, they first met close to his birthplace in Ettrick in 1801, two restless minstrels in common pursuit of the songs of an older generation. But the date Hogg ascribes to this meeting is quite significant because he's suggesting that they met before the publication of the second volume of the Minstrelsy, and in fact it's likely to have been a year later than he says, in 1802 rather than 1801. But I'll quote Hogg's account now, it's quite well known, and again, forgive me if you know it already. One fine day in the summer of 1801, as I was busily engaged working in the field at Ettrick House, Wat Shiel came over to me and said that I would gang awa doon to the Ramsay Clough as fast as my feet could carry me, for there were some gentlemen there who wanted to speak to me. Wha can be at the Ramsay Clough that want me, what? I couldna say, for it wasna me that they spak to in the by-gang, but I'm thinking it's the Shirra and some of his gang. I was rejoiced to hear this, for I had seen and I love that transition from Scott's speech to glossing it. I was rejoiced to hear this, for I had seen the first volumes of the Minstrelsy of the Border, and had copied a number of the old ballads from my mother's recital, and sent them to the editor preparatory for a third volume. I accordingly went towards home to put on my Sunday clothes, but before reaching it, I met with the Shirra and Mr. William Laidlaw coming to visit me. They alighted and remained in our cottage for a space better than an hour, and my mother chanted the old ballad of Old Maitland to them, with which Mr. Scott was highly delighted. Then that must be a very old story indeed, Margaret, said he. Aye, it is that. It is an old story, but mair than that. Except George Wharton and James Stewart, there was nae ane of my songs printed till you printed them yourself, and ye had spoilt them all together. They were made for singing and no for reading, and they're neither richt spell nor richt setting doon. Mr. Scott answered with a hearty laugh and the recital of a verse, but I have forgot what it was, and my mother gave him a rap on the knee with her open hand and said, "It is true enough for all that." Now, it's kind of interesting because there's some timing details for the anoraks that are quite amusing. So, for instance, at the start of the passage, he correctly says that his correspondence with Scott and contributions began after the publication of the first volume, but at the end, he implies that his mother's contributions had already been published. So, in effect, he's rewriting the past to make his family's contributions to Scott's seminal volumes significant earlier than they were. And he would also later say that Scott's imitations were poor quality, saying with deliberate ingenuousness, it has to be said, that they inspired him to write implicitly better in ballad style, taking traditionary stories and chanting them into verse. I'm not going to go into this in great detail here. I've written before about how Scott's ballad editing, I think, is less interventionist than many assume, and I stand by that. But looking again at that account of the first meeting, it does strike me that Hogg is going all out to stress his affinity with Scott as a wild, restless borderer, or a dark, restless borderer. Hogg, or at least his mother, is interacting with the Shirra as an equal. And although the social differences are implicit, she speaks very freely to the Shirra, chiding him for his editorial practice and even slaps him on the knee. So on Hogg's home turf, they're basically borderers together, united by their love of balladry, and in the case of his family, particularly aware of the need to curate community traditions responsibly. And again, I've talked about this before, and I always wanted to do a piece with the title, Don't Mess With My Mother, but in fact the mess is another word in the piece that I want to do, because I think a lot of this is about Hogg asserting his family over Scott. And his affection for his mother was really limitless. I did a piece for her in the biographical dictionary of Scottish women, and I feel that when he writes about her, she always comes over as very spirited, very commanding in her Scots language, you know, and there's a passage in his songs, for instance, where he talks about how his mother told him to set a tune. It was Athol Cummers to words, and she said, "Oh man, it's a shame to hear such a good tune and nae words to it. Gael, I'll bend the hoose like a good lad and mak me a verse to it." So she's a really kind of matriarch of the borders, you know, for Hogg, and he suggests also for Scott. And I think as well as bonding Scott with his borders mother, it's really interesting to think about the physical locations of that meeting, and the map's not very legible, but it's very important because what Hogg is doing is showing that restless borderers are at their most natural in the borders, and more than it being a vague territorial mass like it is in the minstrelsy, the place is name-checked here at the heart of Hogg's Ettrick. So in that map, which is Ainsley's 1773 map of Selkirkshire or Ettrick's Forest, when you look at the locations Hogg mentions in that passage, Ramsey Clook and Ettrick House, you can see that not only is Ettrick House his family farm, his parents' farm, but it's also quintessential ballad country. So were I to go up and point, you would see that at the top left, you've got the location for the Dowie Dens of Yarrow, you've got the heartlands of Hogg's Borders Tales, and Folk, where his grandfather lived, is in the bottom left. So it's basically Hogg's borders. It's the house where he was born, and the fields around it. It's Hogg country, it's Laidlaw country, it's a real place, and one that Scott admired imaginatively. So if the meeting had not actually taken place there, which it does appear to, there are other sources that say it took place there, I think Hogg would have had to make that up. And perhaps he did add a little embroidery in the telling of it. Laidlaw himself remembered the circumstances a little differently. According to Laidlaw, Scott had come specifically to find out the legitimacy of one song, Old Maitland, and then when he heard Hogg's mother perform it, he felt the ballad was undoubtedly ancient, and their eyes sparkled as they exchanged looks. That's Hogg and John Leyden. So William Laidlaw says that that first meeting between Hogg and Scott actually took place the night before, Hogg says, and he talks about how the Laidlaw cousins, the Brydens, invited him and Hogg to tea at Ramsey Clough to meet Scott, and Hogg apparently arrived with an MS of some size, enjoying the sheriff's notice and flattering intention, and they had a long and very enjoyable encounter. So I'll read it because it's not legible for one thing. What he says, this is William Laidlaw: "The qualities of Hogg came out every instant, and his unaffected simplicity and fearless frankness both surprised and charmed the sheriff. They were both very good mimics, and each of them born and bred storytellers, and when Scott took to employ his dramatic talent, he soon found he had us all in his power, for every one of us possessed a quick sense of the ludicrous and perhaps of humour of all kinds. I well recollect how the tears ran down the cheeks of my cousin George, and although Walter's laugh was more quiet, it was easy to see it came from his heart, and Hogg and I were unbounded laughers when the occasion was very good. I mentioned that Hogg was a good mimic, and when the Brydens and I requested him to bear a hand as if a song in his turn, and although we were amused as usual, we soon discovered that Hogg's subjects were too local and perhaps likewise of too low a caste, and doubtless the best proof of our enjoyment of the evening was that Hogg never sung a song that blessed night, and it was between 2 or 3 o'clock when we went to sleep. On the following day, Scott and Laidlaw called at Ettrick House to meet Hogg's mother and hear her sing Old Maitland. Hogg was well aware that Mr. Scott had some dread of a part being forged that had been the cause of his journey into the wilds of Ettrick. When he heard my mother sing it, he was quite satisfied. So William Laidlaw's variation, I think, really suggests strongly that Hogg embroidered on that first occasion to suit his own ends, even if both their recollections ended at the same point, with Laidlaw quoting Hogg, in fact. And like Hogg, William Laidlaw puts Hogg's mother at the centre of the second day. But that very first meeting that he describes is less of a sort of scholarly encounter, as Hogg describes on day 2, and more of a lad's night out with imitations and conversations and alcohol. And when you think Margaret Laidlaw's words were being doubted, it adds another edge to Hogg's relaying of her words as very strong and putting Scott in his place. So he is defending the family loyalty. But the focus in Laidlaw's memory was on Hogg's instant friendship with Scott. They were both good mimics, born and bred storytellers, and in that account you have Hogg presented as the local comedian and Scott responding quieter in his laughs than others because obviously he's a class above them. And Hogg is the local expert, Scott is giving his largesse basically by coming to collect ballads from the poor folks in the country. And that first encounter would be hugely significant. It basically gives Hogg a pass into Edinburgh literary culture with provisos, and it helps his literary development. And you can see after that, Hogg learnt from Scott's manner of presentation. He learnt how to polish traditional songs, he learnt how to fuse texts into composites, as he would later do in his work. And over the years, he kind of maintained that connection with Scott, but I think it changed more for Scott. Reading their accounts of each other, the thing that strikes me most is that Hogg's overt affection remains unchanged, admittedly in public context, whereas Scott, on the other hand, who's often writing privately, but with an eye to future publication, seems to be a bit annoyed with Hogg at times. There's an irritation in the way he presents their interaction. So I've just put two passages side by side. I'm into part 2 now, and as I say, this will be a bit shorter. But in the passage on the left, you've got Hogg reflecting on that early friendship that we've touched on. And he says about Scott, like other young authors, he was vain of his early works and fond of making them a subject of conversation. He recited Glenfinlas one day to me on horseback before publishing it. He read me the Lay of the Last Minstrel from beginning to end. At least James Ballantyne William Erskine, Lord Kinder, and he read Book About. He always preferred their readings to his own. Not so with me. I liked his reading far better than any other body's. Even with its deep tone and Berwick burr, I could always take the poetry and the song better along with me than him, than any of them. He was a capital reader, a far better reader than he was sensible of. Everything that he read was something like his discourse. It always went to the heart. He likewise led me Marmion before its publication, but I think it was in the press, for it was from the proofs that he read it. He read it all himself at 3 sittings. And there's a great deal of warmth there, I think, sincere admiration, with a hint, of course, of Hogg demonstrating that Scott valued his opinion a great deal. But in Scott's memories of their literary discussions, there's much more of this sense of irritation, of Hogg in many ways overstepping the boundaries of how a patronised poet should be expected to behave. And at some point, actually, he's downright rude. So, sorry, Scott, but it's true. So, the passage on the right is quoting from Scott. Hogg came to breakfast this morning, having taken and brought for his companion the Galashiels bard David Thompson, as to a meeting of his Tiviotdale poets. The honest grunter opines with a delightful naivety that Moore's verses are far our sweet, answered by Thompson that Moore's ears or notes, I forget which, were finely strung. They are far our finely strung, replied he of the forest, for mine are just richt. It reminded me of Queen Bess when questioning Melville sharply and closely whether Queen Mary was taller, and extracting an answer in the affirmative, she replied, then your queen is too tall, for I am just the proper height. So you can see Scott, they both posture. I mean, you just take that as read, but he is implying that he's superior to Hogg, and even making allowances for contemporary satirical standards, which are quite low. The passage is less endearing about Scott, for me at least, than the way the Shepherd writes about Scott. The only reason I'm prepared to let this go, and perhaps the reason that Hogg let these kind of encounters pass over his head, was that Scott did prove his deeper allegiances by supporting Hogg in his interactions with the Duke of Buccleuch, and not very successfully, but also with the Royal Literary Society. So his heart was maybe in the right place, but his voice wasn't always in the right place for his words. And perhaps too, the demands on Scott's time, I think, are showing in these passages. I mean, these are, that last one was from 1825, and this one is 1827, it's from the journal. So again, I've put them side by side, and when Hogg's talking about Scott's visit to his house, he waxes lyrical about Scott's social skills and his ability to entertain. When I was accustomed to breakfast with Sir Walter long ago, as mentioned, we just got our roll, our tea and our egg, and I have heard him declare often that he never knew what a good breakfast was until he came to my cottage, but that he improved on the hint. I, however, had got a previous hint that he and Sir A. Ferguson would booth me on such a morning, and accordingly, as we have a view of the road for more than 2 miles from Altrive, the moment that they sat down, they were presented with abundance of broiled salmon, broiled ham and egg, and mutton ham, all as if it had been my ordinary breakfast. From that day forth, no man would have missed at Sir Walter's breakfast table a plate of reindeer, tongue, ham, corned beef and eggs. But the last time he dined with me was at Mount Benger in the autumn of 1829, and I never saw him more merry and jocular. Were I to recite all the little droll stories he told me that day, they would fill half a volume by themselves. But I could not do them justice, for though I account myself a very good teller of a story, yet that man never was born who could tell a good story in as few words as Sir Walter. Scott, on the other hand, sometimes found visits from Hogg to be quite tiresome, and he has no difficulty in using puns to put another writer down. So in 1827 he writes, Tuesday, Ettrick Shepherd arrived. Thursday, this is at Abbotsford, we went to breakfast at Huntly Burn, and I wandered all the morning in the woods to avoid an English party who came to see the house. When I came home, I found my cousin, Colonel Russell, and his sister, so I had no work today, but my labour at proofs in the morning. Today I dismissed my aide-de-camp Shortreed, a fine lad but a little forward. The boar of the forest left us after breakfast, and he often does refer to Hogg as a boar and other uncomplimentary terms. Now, Scott, to put this in perspective, was not as cruel as his son-in-law. I know we've got experts on Lockhart here, and I thought I would just quote a little bit of the famous sofa incident that I mentioned before. And this is, I guess, how other people from the outside saw the two of them. Lockhart says, the next time that Hogg's business carried him to Edinburgh, he waited upon Scott, who invited him to dinner in Castle Street, in company with William Laidlaw, who happened also to be in town. When Hogg entered the drawing room, Mrs. Scott, being at the time in a delicate state of health, was reclining on a sofa. The shepherd, after being presented and making his best bow, forthwith took possession of another sofa placed opposite to hers, and stretched himself thereupon all his length, for, as he said afterwards, I thought I could never do wrong to copy the lady of the house. As his dress at this period was precisely that in which any ordinary herdsman attends cattle to the market, and as his hands, moreover, bore most legible marks of a recent sheep smearing, the lady of the house did not observe with perfect equanimity the novel usage to which her chintz was exposed. The shepherd, however, remarked nothing of all of this, dined heartily and drank freely, and by jest, anecdote and song afforded plentiful merriment to the more civilised part of the company. As the liquor operated, his familiarity increased and strengthened. From Mr. Scott he advanced to Shirra, and thence to Scott, Walter and Watty, until at supper he fairly convulsed the whole party by addressing Mrs. Scott as Charlotte. Now, so there's a lot of venom in that one. And I remember when I first read that account, actually, it was in the early stages of my PhD, and I was telling my dad about it, and his response was very to the point. He just said, well, what was Scott's wife's name? I said, Charlotte. Yeah, exactly. You know, so it was fine, apparently, for Scott to call Hogg's mother, and later his wife, by their first names, but not for a shepherd to use a lady's. And to be fair, as James Robertson and I we were talking about this last year at an NLS online event, or the year before maybe, there's no suggestion that Scott objected to Hogg calling his wife Charlotte, but the implication is there in a description, I think, that indicates how the outside world viewed the Hogg-Scott relationship outside their nice little bubble in the borders where they could have a bit of banter and so forth. But when Hogg writes about meeting Scott on his home turf in Ettrick in Edinburgh, there's much more of a sense of a lasting friendship, and that extended to their families. So there's a lovely account where he talks about how Scott always seemed particularly pleased with Mrs. Hogg and paid her a great deal of deference. He says, "As it behoved me, I took her down and introduced her at Abbotsford as soon as we were married, and from that day forth she became a favourite. There was a good deal of company there, yet he did Margaret the honour of leading her into dinner and placing her beside him. As for the poor woman, she perfectly adored him. That day when he last left Mount Benger, he snatched my little daughter Maggie up in his arms and kissed her, saying, 'God bless you, my dear child,' on which my wife burst into a flood of tears. When I came back in again from setting my away, I said, 'What ails you, Margaret?' 'Oh,' she said, 'I thought if he had but just done the same to them all, I know not what in the world I would not have given.' The last time she saw him was in his own house in Maitland Street, a short time before he finally left it. She and I were passing by chance from Charlotte Square to the Lothian Road, when I happened to say, 'See, yonder is Sir Walter's house at yon lamp.' Whenever she heard that, she refused to go by without seeing him once more. As she said so, when in we went and were received with all the cordiality of old friends. But he addressed his whole discourse to her, never heeding me, but leaving me to shift for myself. He talked to her of our family and of our education, of their education and of our prospects in life." And Hogg's wife's response and the remembered conversations, I think, suggest something of an inequality. There's Scott offering advice and a benison to the Hogg family, for which they were grateful. But I think Hogg's affection for Scott, and certainly his wife's affection, is equally evident. And that was something that lasted for Hogg. His account of the final meeting with Scott, which is tiny, but I'll read some of it, is very moving, very, very powerful. He says that the last time I saw his loved and honoured face was at the little inn on my own farm in the autumn of 1830. He sent me word that he was to pass on such a day, but that he was sorry he could not call and see Mrs. Hogg and the bairns, Altrive being so far off the road. I accordingly waited at the inn and handed him out of the carriage. His daughter was with him, but we left her at the inn. He walked very ill indeed, for his weak leg had become completely useless, but he leaned on my shoulder all the way, and did me the honour of saying that he never leaned on a firmer or a surer. We talked of many things, past, present, and to come, but both his memory and onward calculation appeared to me then to be much decayed. He expressed his deepest concern for my welfare and success in life, and his sorrow for my worldly misfortunes. Before we parted, I mentioned my plan to him of trusting an edition of my tales to Lockhart. He disapproved of it altogether, and said he would not for anything that Lockhart should enter on such a responsibility, for that considering my Ramstam way of writing, the responsibility was a heavy and a dangerous one. I use his very words. And then he turned, half round, leaning on his crutch, and fixing his eyes on the ground and on my cottage alternately, after hanging down his large eyebrows for a good long space, he said, "You have written a great deal that might be made available, Hogg, with proper attention, and I am certain that some day or other it will become available to you or your family. But in my opinion, this is not the proper season, for at present all things, and in particular literature, are going straight down the hill to ruin." And this is the one place I can think of where Hogg hints at a vulnerability in Scott, not surprisingly, as his last months, and also managed to get in a dig at Lockhart, apparently in Scott's words, at the same time, which is kind of satisfying for those of us in the Hogg camp. But the way that he describes taking Scott's arm and sympathising with his state of mind, I think says a great deal about Hogg as a man as well as a writer, just as it says something about Scott and some things that Hogg wanted to suggest about Scott. And in many ways, I think it's possibly one of the more honest times that he does write about Scott, because it's reflecting a friendship that lasted for decades, from their youth into their last years. And it's a bond, basically, which is forged in the borders and endures in the borders. And Hogg suggests in that passage that it proved stronger ultimately than social imbalances and literary restlessness. And on balance, Hogg did look back on that friendship as a source of pleasure, a privilege, and an honour. And again, in the illegible text, you can see him talking about this. And there's a lovely statement right at the start of that passage where he says, there cannot be a better trait given of Sir Walter's character than that all who knew him intimately loved him. Nay, they almost worshipped him. And then he goes on to talk a bit about the Ballantynes and how they absolutely adored him. And then he says, Scott was the greatest man in the world while he lived, and must long be remembered as such now that he's gone. What are kings or emperors compared with Sir Walter Scott? Dust and sand, the most part of their names regarded with detestation. But here is a name that, next to that of William Shakespeare's, will descend with rapt admiration to all the ages of futurity. And is it not a proud boast for an old shepherd that he could call this man friend and could associate with him every day and every hour that he chose? And he continues in that vein, but I like the bit at the end of the passage I've got here too. He says, as long as Sir Walter Scott wrote poetry, there was no man or woman ever thought of reading or writing anything but poetry. But the instant that he gave over writing poetry, there was neither man or woman read it anymore. All turned to tales and novels, which I, amongst others, was obliged to. Such is the man we have lost, and such a man we shall never again see in our day. And I think in reflecting on all of this, I completely acknowledge that both writers benefited from that relationship. And for Hogg, the relationship associated him, as he says, with the finest Scottish writer of his age, or possibly of any age, I think people here in this room might think, offering him literary opportunities. And he suggests that Scott was a creative sounding board for him too. It's a genuine admiration, a lasting admiration and fondness. But I think Scott equally had a huge amount to gain from Hogg. I mean, initially, he got a source of songs and stories, as seen with the minstrelsy, and I think he also got what can only be described as Borders kudos, because Hogg was the real peasant poet deal. But Scott's relationship with Hogg was one amongst many with other writers. And Scott's sentiments, I think, were more restless. I think they changed over time as his need for Borders information perhaps waned. And although it was a close relationship, it was clearly, to use a current phrase, socially distanced. But for both writers, I think their friendship was a conscious act, with slightly different motivations and expressions, but it was undoubtedly sincere. They were bonded, I think, by that mutual and quite genuine love for Borders culture. So I'll end as I started, I think, with a little bit of Water the Clwch. We left him at the start of my talk as he entered the adventure as a restless borderer on a berry black steed. He then goes on sacrilegiously to plunder various abbeys, raid and do the stuff that Borders reivers do. But I quite like a wee bit at the end. Take it as you will, think about who the minor character might echo, but he's certainly a dark, restless borderer like Scott and a man of the forest like Hogg. So I'll just read you a bit from right at the end. An elf came up by Teviot stream, moving beneath a mighty beam. Ah, 'tis an imp both staunch and true, the little page of Water the Clwch. Behind the ranks he pressed along, nor once was noticed in the throng, till close up by his master's side, when thus he spoke with crabbed pride. Here's for ye, Clwch, deal that ye be as tired of that goad as me. Actually, I do have to stop for a second, because Hogg likes demonic doubles as well as possibly echoing Hogg and Scotland's relationship. Anyway, "Ah, bravest boy of mountain birth, my own good sword by heaven and earth," cried Wat, and as he drew it out, scarce earthly was his joyous shout. "Ha for the battle, kinsman true! High in the tykes give hell its due! Now for the cheer of Water the Clwch." Thank you.
Thank you, Valentina, for really fascinating insight into that friendship between Scott and Hogg, the Restless relationship as it seems to have been. But I think we've heard everything from meeting mothers, brilliant breakfasts, lads' night out, which sounds actually quite good, and of course the intricacies of their relationship, whether that's critical and honest, or as you, I think, have shown us, very affectionate and tender as well. So thank you so much for taking us on that journey. So on which note I'd like to open the floor for any questions for Valentina this evening.
I think really a question. I think there's a huge amount of John Gibson Lockhart's scholarship about to come upon us. So I think we're really going to dive into it now to see what are the Hogg links, and you've given us another angle. So there's 3 big names in the borders. You're really getting us the ones that live with and all. So that's prompting future expensive purchases, no doubt, in certain academic presses.
Anyone like to do a trailer at this point?
In your own.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Mrs. Scott criticised, Mrs. Hogg, sorry, criticised Walter Scott for the writing down the balance. That's well known, sure. What's the background to that she felt, as many of us do, that the border ballad is a living thing, and does not, by encasing it in print and in ink, Scott had done a disservice to a living tradition.
I absolutely think that. And in fact, I've written about that. I wrote an article called Collection as Colonisation, and I think that the implication in that article, and I do feel it's how Hogg felt primarily, is that I think the reason I said I wanted to do something called, I was going to actually do a talk called Don't with my mother, is that it's basically what he's actually saying is that Scott is printing the ballads without the proper context. So he's giving historical details, which is fine, but he doesn't have the connection with the Borders community. He doesn't bring that out overtly. It's hard to find, but yes, I completely agree with what you're saying. So it's a kind of ambivalent thing, because at one hand, it's good that they're published and that they reach a wider audience, but on another hand, they're going out of the community's control. So it's not about my mother and my grandfather and my uncle and my cousins passing on songs through performance to other people who will then take them forward with proper respect for what they mean to the community. It's putting them into an uncontrolled environment where the likes of Locker have the chance to do what they want with them, do you know? So there's a real ambivalence in there, I think. Maybe there's also a sense of, Hogg wishing she could have got there first, do you know? So, like he did with the Jacobite songs later. But it is about being uncomfortable. And it's really hard to know, because all we know about Margaret Laidlaw is what Hogg says about her, and also Hogg's brother also said some stuff about her, but not in that kind of detail that Hogg does. So it does sound as if she was a kind of matriarch type, basically. But to what extent Hogg is putting how he felt into his mother's mouth in that passage, and to what extent it's fair, is really difficult to see at this point. But I completely agree with what you just suggested. I think that's spot on.
Could I ask about a detail about that? Hogg says his mother told Scott that he hadn't written these things down properly.
Yeah.
Does that imply that she had read written versions of them? And
Yeah, I think it does.
Which would require her to be able to read.
Yeah.
That's why I was interested
Well,
in.
yeah, I mean,
do we know about her level of literacy from other sources?
I mean, she taught Hogg to read. So I mean, basically, he was homeschooled, largely from religious books. Woodrow's works on Covenant, fourfold state. But I think the other thing, actually, just to come back to what we said, that really bothered her, and which Hogg, or bothered Hogg on behalf of his mother, which he corrected in his own publications, was there wasn't any music. And I think that's not actually explicit in what she says, but I think that's what bothered Hogg and his mother most, was that they were words without music. And why didn't he include music? Do you know? I mean, people had done it already, Scots Musical Museum. I don't know. But I think quite possibly that's, although it's not explicitly named, that's the aspect that really You know, it's Bronson wrote in his book on child's music. You know, when is a ballad not a ballad? When it's not got any music. You know, they're taken out of their natural environment, which is as a song, and made into poems. And I think that's. Would you say, Joe? I mean.
Yeah, I think the difference is simply maybe partly down to the fact that Scott had a cloth ear, whereas Hogg had got a really good ear for music, and taught himself to play the fiddle and could pick up a tune and repeat it easily. It's between somebody who can hear it and somebody who can't hear it.
I can't quote you on that, Scott, with the cloth ear. Would anyone like to speak in defence of Scott at this point? Because I feel I'm not the right person.
The minstrelsy of the Scottish border is a contribution to a genre which starts with Percy in the middle 18th century, which does treat popular tradition in ballads as a source for poetry, and that these things have value as words, and you need to know the tunes. So it's not Scott himself who's doing that.
No, but I think it shows the influence of the chapbook and the broadside on Scott's collecting as well. You know, where it's about words and also that the cloth ear theory holds good for me, because clearly the words were what really interested Scott. And as I say, I've never really had a problem with what he did in the minstrelsy. It was fashionable at one point to say he totally trashed them, but I mean he didn't. He made the sort of changes that a singer would make to a song. He kind of improved phrasing. He left the bits that mattered. So he did understand the way the ballad works, but the lack of music is an offence against ballad.
Hi, this is not in defence of Scott. I don't work in this period. I'm really several decades later, but thinking about another iteration of folk song collection ahead to somebody like Cecil Sharp, where it is about preserving the music as well, really, but there's still that same dynamic of cultural appropriation that people want to level against folk song collection.
Yeah.
Somebody like Dave Harker has written a very provocative book many, many decades ago called Fake Song, which is thinking about the way in which the category of the folk, even though it's meant to be set up as this authentic category, is already something that is, as it were, a construction of those doing the collecting. And so I wonder whether, even when we get Hogg's textual transcriptions of his mother, we need to be a little bit kind of wary before we set her up as the, you know, the kind of essential embodiment of the folk, if that makes sense. Even though she may well have been this kind of vital and energetic person.
The interesting thing Hogg does is he doesn't actually present her in that way. He presents her as somebody who is highly intelligent, who's not afraid to question someone who is from a different class and a different level of education. So actually, in some ways, because he is also representative of the community, I think the other thing that makes him really uncomfortable about it is the whole. This is why I do think that Hogg's use of traditions is about sharing them rather than collecting them. So it's quite a subtle distinction, but it is there. And for Scott, it's about demonstrating his knowledge of ballad and what they mean and their historical context. But for Hogg and his mother, these are life. You know, they're not something that you separate from the rest of your culture. It's like, you know, I'm very old, and a long time ago, myself and Tom McCain, who's now director of the Elphinstone Institute, did a tour of the States with, a small tour must be said, with Elizabeth Stewart, who was well known as a traditional singer. And the point of that was we called it a complete performer, because you know, one of the things that's really interesting, I could go on about this for a long time, about Hogg's corpus, is he's not just interested in songs. You know, he's interested in documenting the whole plethora of community life in the borders, from dogs to storms to ghosts to covenanters. It's part of a whole for him, and again, I just kind of keep thinking that maybe one of the things that's disturbing to him about the border minstrelsy is that although it's got history in it, it's not really about Borders culture of the early 19th century, which it really is. So I think that the kind of fake song thing is a false lead. But the reason that passage gets quoted so often is it really, you can unpack quite a lot in it about the way Hogg felt about what Scott had done in the minstrelsy. Not about the editing, I think, so much as the processes of removing these songs from their culture or putting the packaging on differently. It's difficult to say. I went through a period of being really annoyed at Scott, and then I went through being okay about it, and I think I'm somewhere in between at the moment. Yeah, it's a very... basically it just shows how much Hogg cared about Border songs, and I think Scott did too, but just from a different perspective.
Hearing lots of these questions, it feels like there might be an apt topic and a sort of content for conversations and questions over a glass of wine later, but I get ahead of myself. So unless there are any final questions, then I'd like to once again thank you, Valentina, for answering those questions so fully, and invite Peter Carside to give the vote of thanks.
Shall I take up that from Mike? Well, Hogg and Scott, there's an old topic, and since there's been a lot of, there's been more study of Hogg in recent years, you could say that it's a very well-researched subject by now. But you've breathed new life into it, Valentina, partly because I think you're so personally involved yourself, more than I am in some respects. Like you, I've worked on both Scott and Hogg, and also more recently the dreaded Lockhart. And when I'm engaged in any one of these, I tend to see it from their point of view. From Scott's point of view, my gosh, how aggravating Hogg must have seemed sometimes when Scott was trying to get on with his busy professional and literary life. Hogg insisting on being equality through being a bard. At the same time, Hogg, the real McCoy, coming from the heart of balladry, hugely talented, as I'm sure he knew he was, able to write Scott's poetry better than Scott could himself, as you implied partly, yet kept out of the literary scene in some respects where Scott held sway. And then Lockhart turning him into a guilty couple, perhaps of turning him into a buffoon, drinking buffoon, or whatever the expression is, yet working on his life of Scott and trying to hold together Scott's reputation and the record of Scott's life and the Scott family fortunes. Hogg writing little anecdotes about Charlotte and her illegitimacy, alleged illegitimacy, how Lockhart must have been infuriated. And he did turn against Hogg, overturned against him, I think, overdid it, I think, in his life of Scott. But from these parts, something greater came, a real dynamic. I know we're not supposed to concentrate entirely on confessions of a justified sinner these days, and as you said, the Hogg's output is much larger than that. But in a way, all these components come together in that story. The editor at the beginning of Confessions, he's like Scott as a historian, historical novelist, so assured, knowing all about social mores and so on, yet missing the point over and over again palpably. Then the sinner's narrative, a little bit like Hogg at his most isolated himself, his most dependent, close to Scottish history, yet at the same time detached from society. And then in the final stages, the Blackwoodians, John Wilson and Lockhart, riding over a landscape they don't fully understand, exhuming a corpse which for them is just a rather ghastly sort of materiality. All those come together in what I think is probably the greatest Scottish novel of that period, possibly of all time. And this came from the relationship of these people, and that's why it's so vital. And you've reminded of those things in an eloquent, to the point, informative talk, for which, both on behalf of the English Department and the University of Edinburgh and for the Edinburgh School to Scott, I offer you our thanks. Thank you.
And now, just before we bring things to a close, and I'm aware I don't want to keep anybody from the glass of wine longer than I need to, but just want to take the opportunity to mention, first of all, a reminder of the next Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club event, which is taking place on the 16th of November, looking to David to nod, 16th of November, and we'll be hearing from David Maclay about the Speculative Society, so very much looking forward to that occasion, and do be in touch if you're looking to get tickets for that particular event. And I also want to just spend a moment to say the various thank yous, so of course to the Advocates Library for letting us use this lovely venue as ever, as Peter has mentioned, to Edinburgh University and to the Scott Club and all the folk involved in bringing about these events. And then the last two thanks goes to everybody for coming to the event this evening, asking questions and being engaged with the content. And the very final thanks go to Valentina for letting us take the opportunity to really re-examine a friendship that I think we all think we know, and actually it's a lot more complex, creative than often first meets the eye. So thank you ever so much again, Valentina. And do stay for a glass of wine.